What if I told you the first Thanksgiving wasn't anything like the postcard perfect image we hold today? No golden roasted turkey, no cranberry sauce, no pumpkin pie. Instead, the settlers and the Wampanoag shared roasted venison, wild goose, smoky shellfish, nutcakes, and even seal meat pulled from the rocky shores. For 3 days in 1621, this feast was not about tradition, but about survival, and every dish on the table carried with it a story not just of hunger, but of resilience, cultural exchange, and the raw, untamed flavors of a new world. To understand this moment, we must rewind the clock. The year before, nearly half of the pilgrims had died from disease, starvation, and brutal winter conditions. By the autumn of 1621, survival itself felt like a miracle. The first harvest had been gathered, but their supplies remained fragile. The feast was not just celebration, it was relief, a collective exhale after a year balanced on the knife's edge of extinction. And at its center were foods both strange and vital, meals that history has often ignored. Take roast goose, for instance. When we think of Thanksgiving, our minds instantly jump to turkey. Yet, turkeys were not the bird of honor in 1621. The settlers prized goose above all, fatty, flavorful, and abundant in the marshes. Goose provided more than taste, it was fuel for survival. In a world where every calorie meant endurance against the oncoming cold, fat was not trimmed away as waste. It was treasured. Goose fat rendered energy, and energy meant life. Seasoned with sage, savory, and wild herbs taught by the Wampanoag, roasted goose became more than food. It was hope seared over open flame. But this feast was not only about game from the woods. The shoreline, with its abundance of seafood, became a lifeline. Steamed clams, cooked in pits lined with hot stones and seaweed, were introduced to the settlers by their indigenous neighbors. For the pilgrims, clams were a revelation back in England. They had been seen as little more than food for the desperate. Here, they became sustenance and medicine, all at once. Rich in minerals, briny with ocean flavor, clams replenished the weary bodies of people who had survived on hard biscuits and salted pork during their crossing. This was not just a meal. It was nutrition disguised as a feast. And then, lobster, today a luxury. But in Plymouth colony, it was so abundant it was considered poor man's food. Colonists wrote of being forced to eat it too often. Yet, in 1621, lobster roasted directly on the coals meant easy, plentiful nourishment. It wasn't about drawn butter or lemon wedges. It was survival in its purest, smoky form. Lobster was proof that this land could feed them if they were willing to learn its rhythms. For the pilgrims, this realization was revolutionary. Survival depended on embracing what the new world offered, not clinging to the comforts of the old, but sometimes a taste of the old world did make its way to the fires. When a swan was caught and roasted whole, the bird carried more than meat. In England, swan had been a delicacy for nobles, a rare feast dish symbolizing wealth and grandeur. On American soil, roasting swan was a statement. The settlers had endured famine, yet here they were, capable of producing something reminiscent of aristocratic feasts back home. For the Wampanoag, swan was just another marsh bird. But for the colonists, it was nostalgia on a spit. A reminder that even in the wilderness, fragments of the familiar could survive. While swan was a rare delicacy, other dishes carried the essence of endurance. Stewed beans with squash, for example, represented more than a meal. This was indigenous science. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in perfect harmony. Corn stalks supported the beans. Beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, and squash leaves shaded the ground to retain moisture. A system of agricultural balance centuries old, that the colonists had to adopt to survive. Stewed together with herbs or meat scraps, beans and squash became the backbone of sustenance. Proof that survival depended not just on hunting but on farming in new ways. And alongside the stews and roasts, fish cooked on wooden planks brought the flavor of the sea into the feast. Striped bass grilled by the fire, its skin crackling, its flesh infused with smoky oils from the wood itself, offered something fresh, light, and abundant. For colonists used to boiling or baking fish in bland broths, this was culinary innovation. For the Wampanoag, it was simply tradition. But in that moment, it was knowledge exchanged, survival made delicious. Not all dishes were grand. Some were small, delicate, and deeply flavored, like partridge roasted with wild herbs. These little birds roasted quickly, and their seasoning, sage, juniper, or wild onions, spoke of the forest itself. After months of stale rations, the colonists tasted not just food, but the wild character of the new land. It was humbler than swan, but no less meaningful, and even amid the savory dishes, there were bursts of sweetness. Dried blueberries and currants, gathered in summer and stored through winter. For the Wampanoag, dried fruits were energy, medicine, and trade. For the pilgrims, who had endured scurvy and hunger, they were jewels of tart sweetness, a reminder of summer warmth and a brief escape from bitter survival. The feast also hinted at deserts of a sort. Hickory nut cakes, rustic patties of ground nuts, cornmeal, and dried berries, baked on hot stones. They were chewy, nutty, smoky, the 1621 version of energy bars. Sweetness was rare in the colony, but these nutcakes offered both pleasure and sustenance. Every bite was calories stored for the leaner days to come. This was the first Thanksgiving. Not turkey and pie, but roasted goose and swan, smoky shellfish, earthy beans, nutcakes, and berries. It was not about tradition, it was about survival. Every dish carried meaning, lessons in adaptation, stories of cultural exchange, and the unspoken truth that without the Wampanoag, Plymouth colony would not have endured. But survival was not simply about food, it was about alliances. When Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, arrived with 90 of his men, he did not come empty-handed. He brought venison 5 whole deer to share with the settlers. This was not just generosity, it was diplomacy served on a platter. In Wampanoag culture, venison was not only sustenance but also a symbol of respect and kinship. To offer it at a feast was to acknowledge partnership, to extend peace in a world where mistrust simmered under the surface. For the pilgrims, venison was both foreign and familiar. In England, deer belonged to the king. Hunting them was often illegal for commoners. To suddenly feast freely on roasted venison in the New World was exhilarating. It tasted not just of meat, but of liberty, of opportunity, of survival beyond the rigid laws of the old country. This shared venison, smoky and rich, embodied more than flavor. It was the binding of two peoples, if only for a fragile moment in time. And yet, survival was fragile. Every dish on that rough-hewn table held contradictions. Clams that fed them today might run out tomorrow. Venison shared in friendship could just as easily be withheld in conflict. Even corn, the crop that became their salvation, had been born of desperate reliance on Wampanoag knowledge. Without their guidance, the settlers' stubborn European farming methods would have left them starving. But for 3 days in 1621, contradiction gave way to celebration. Imagine the sounds: laughter, fire crackling, the hollow clatter of wooden trenchers. Picture the smells: roasting meat, salty sea air, herbs crushed underfoot. Here the languages English and Algonquian mingling awkwardly, yet somehow creating understanding. This was not just a meal. It was the birth of something larger. Still, to romanticize it would be to miss the truth. This feast was not the harmonious, eternal friendship we paint in storybooks. It was temporary, a fragile balance. For the Wampanoag, it was strategy and alliance with strange newcomers, who could just as easily become enemies. For the Pilgrims, it was necessity, food, and knowledge they could not have produced alone. The first Thanksgiving was less about gratitude and more about survival disguised as gratitude. And yet, that survival mattered. Without roasted goose, they might not have endured the winter. Without clams and lobster, their bodies might not have been nourished enough to resist disease. Without beans, squash, and corn, their farming might have failed entirely. Without venison, the fragile alliance might never have taken root. This is why the real first Thanksgiving is so much richer, darker, and more fascinating than the simplified tale we tell today. It was a collision of worlds. Every dish on that table was a story of adaptation, of knowledge passed, of cultures meeting in cautious trust. It was not a feast of plenty, but a feast of survival. And so when we set our tables today with turkey stuffing and cranberry sauce, perhaps we should also remember the smoky clams, the roasted goose, the chewy nutcakes, and the venison roasted by two peoples who did not yet know their future together. The first Thanksgiving was not tradition, it was survival transformed into celebration. Close your eyes for a moment and step into Plymouth. Autumn 1621. The air is sharp with the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The harvest has been gathered, the days are growing shorter, and the colonists thin, scarred from hunger, many still mourning the dead prepare for a feast unlike anything they have ever known. Imagine the fires glowing against the night sky. Long wooden spits, turning, dripping fat, hissing as it falls onto embers. The settlers gather in their rough wool clothing, stiff from salt and labor. Across from them stand the Wampanoag, their garments woven from deerskin and furs, their faces painted with earth pigments, their movements deliberate and steady. Two worlds, two cultures, standing shoulder to shoulder, not as equals, but as people bound by the most primal force, the need to eat, the need to live. The sounds of the feast echo through the clearing, the crunch of lobster shells split by stone tools, the hollow thump of clams thrown onto hot rocks, their shells snapping open like tiny firecrackers, the rhythmic grinding of corn into meal, the pounding of pestles in wooden mortar. Children laugh, their voices cutting through the smoke, chasing one another as dogs bark and scavenge for scraps. Now, look at the food laid out before them. It is not presented in polished silver platters or elegant ceramic bowls. Instead, it is rustic, raw, elemental. Venison roasted over open flame, its juices staining the hands of those who carve it. Steamed mussels, gleaming wet, eaten straight from their shells. Fat geese sizzling, seasoned with sage and garlic like ramps, pulled from the earth. Cornbread, dense and coarse, baked on flat stones. Nutcakes, smoky and sweet, passed from hand to hand. To the colonists, each bite is revelation. No longer the moldy biscuits of their voyage, no longer salted pork that reeked of the ship's hold. This food tastes alive, wild, fresh, of the earth itself. To the Wampanoag, it is familiar, but seeing it shared with strangers makes it something new, something cautious, something powerful. But beneath the feasting lies tension. The Wampanoag know their world is shifting. The newcomers are weak, yes, but they are stubborn, armed, determined. Sharing food is not just generosity, it's calculation. A way to bind these foreigners into a web of obligation. For the colonists, every lesson, learn it how to plant corn, how to hunt local game, how to fish the rivers' survival, borrowed from their hosts. Gratitude and dependence sit side by side. The firelight flickers across faces as night falls. One colonist lifts a cup of weak ale, brewed from whatever grain could be spared, and raises it in a toast. His voice cracks not with eloquence, but with exhaustion and awe. They are alive. They are eating, for the first time in months, perhaps years. There is laughter in their voices and warmth in their bellies. And somewhere, in the shadows beyond the firelight, the forest watches. The rustle of leaves hides owls and foxes. The ocean tide rolls in and out, steady as the heartbeat of the land. The feast is small against the vastness of the wilderness, but to those gathered, it feels monumental. It feels eternal. This is not the Thanksgiving we think we know. It is harsher, hungrier, truer. A feast born not of tradition, but of desperation. A fragile truce sealed with venison and smoke. A celebration that is both victory and omen, joy and warning. For in the years to come, the fragile peace would fracture. The alliance would strain, then break. Conflict would replace communion. But for 3 days in 1621, under the crackle of fire and the glow of autumn skies, two peoples ate together, and survival for once tasted like celebration. The camera sweeps low over the New England coastline, grey waves smashing against jagged rocks. Forests of crimson and gold stretching endlessly inland. A narrator's voice cuts through the crashing surf, deep and steady. It was a land untamed, a wilderness vast and unforgiving. And in the autumn of 1621, against all odds, survival had been won not by conquest, but by the sharing of a meal. The scene shifts. Smoke rising from fire pits, men turning spits heavy with goose and venison, women grinding maize, children darting between legs, laughter rising into the chilly dusk. But the lens lingers on their faces, worn, scarred, lined with hunger that had only just begun to fade. For every smile there is a shadow. For every cheer, a silence that speaks of those who did not live to see this feast. A slow pan across the table, if it can be called a table. Rough planks, bark still clinging to the edges, laden with food that glistens in the firelight. Clams steaming, lobsters split open, fish roasted on wooden planks, nutcakes stacked in uneven piles. The feast is primal, chaotic, yet full of life. The narrator's voice grows more urgent. This was no holiday, no tradition, no myth. It was a truce carved from desperation, a banquet born from death and survival. Every bite was more than food, it was a symbol, a story, a fragile piece. Cut to Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, his eyes sharp, his presence commanding. He gestures to his men, and 5 deer are laid down before the settlers. The camera lingers on the colonist's face is astonishment, hunger, relief, but also unease. They know what this means. The Wampanoag are not merely guests, but hosts, teachers, lifelines. The balance of power is delicate, the future uncertain. The music swells, drums beating like a heartbeat, strings rising like tension in the air. The settlers raise their cups, wooden and crude. A toast, the firelight glimmers in their eyes. For a fleeting moment, there is unity. For a fleeting moment, two worlds sit at one table. Then silence. The camera pulls back, high above the clearing. The feast looks small, fragile, swallowed by the vast darkness of the surrounding forest. A tiny light flickering in an ocean of wilderness. The narrator returns, voice heavy, almost prophetic. History remembers this as the first Thanksgiving. But the truth is harder, sharper. It was a pause before the storm. A fragile alliance that could not hold. Yet, in that brief autumn, for 3 days of fire and feasting, survival became celebration, and a legend was born. The screen fades to black. The sound of crackling fire lingers. Then, one final whisper: the real Thanksgiving was never about tradition. It was about survival. The fires have long burned out. The laughter has faded. The clearing where colonists and Wampanoag once gathered is silent now, swallowed by centuries. But the echo of that feast still lingers, not as a simple story of friendship, but as a symbol of something much more complicated. The narrator's voice is low, contemplative. The first Thanksgiving was never meant to be a myth. It was a moment, a fragile pause between survival and conflict, between gratitude and fear. For the settlers, it marked the first breath of hope in a land that had nearly consumed them. For the Wampanoag, it was a gesture of alliance, a gamble for coexistence that history would later betray. Images flash across the screen: corn swaying in the wind, venison roasting over fire, lobsters crackling on hot coals. Then shadows of war, treaties broken, land taken, lives lost. The sweetness of nutcakes fades into the bitterness of what was to come. The voice continues. Over time, the story was reshaped, smoothed, romanticized. The rough edges of hunger and death, of politics and survival, were softened into a tale of gratitude and abundance. Turkey replaced goose. Pumpkin pie appeared where none had existed. The feast became a holiday, and the holiday became a legend. The camera lingers on a modern Thanksgiving table: golden turkey, bowls of cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, family gathered in warm light. It is beautiful, but the narrator's words cut through softly, almost like a warning. But if we listen closely, beneath the clatter of silverware and the murmur of family prayers, we can still hear the truth. The crackle of fire, the crash of waves, the voices of two peoples sitting together in cautious trust. A reminder that Thanksgiving was never about comfort. It was about survival, sacrifice, and the fragile hope that two worlds might find common ground. The music shifts, somber, reflective. The final words fall like an echo across time. To remember the first Thanksgiving is not to remember a feast. It is to remember what it means to endure, what it means to depend on one another, and what it costs. When survival is mistaken for peace, the screen fades to black. Only silence remains.